If you left a block of modern supermarket cheese outside a refrigerator for a week, most people would assume it's ruined. Softening, sweating, strange smells, all signals we've been trained to interpret as danger. Yet medieval people stored cheese for months, sometimes years, in cellars, caves, barns, and stone rooms with no refrigeration, no plastic, no preservatives, and relied on it as a core survival food. This wasn't accidental, and it wasn't because medieval people had stronger stomachs. Medieval cheese didn't rot because it was designed from the first step not to rot. The biggest mistake modern minds make is assuming medieval cheese was just old milk. In reality, cheese was a controlled biological system built to destroy the conditions that cause decay. Medieval cheesemakers didn't fight bacteria blindly. They chose which life was allowed to win. Everything began with the understanding, learned through centuries of loss, that water is rot's greatest ally. Milk spoils because it is mostly water. The first goal of cheesemaking was to remove as much water as possible as early as possible. Curds were cut small, stirred aggressively, and pressed with weight. The harder the press, the longer the cheese would live. This is why medieval survival cheeses were dense, heavy, and dry compared to many modern varieties. Soft cheeses absolutely existed in medieval times, but they were never meant to last. They were eaten immediately, often within days. Long-term cheese was an entirely different category. It was not food for enjoyment, it was food for time. Salt was the next layer of defense, and medieval cheesemakers treated it as a tool, not a flavor. Salt pulled remaining moisture out of the curd and disrupted harmful bacterial growth. But more importantly, salt controlled microbial balance. Too little salt invited rot. Too much salt killed beneficial organisms and cracked the cheese. Medieval cheesemakers learned exact salting rhythms by touch, taste, and smell, knowledge passed down, not written. Then came the most misunderstood element, intentional microbial occupation. Medieval cheese was never sterile. It was colonized early by bacteria and molds that consumed sugars and proteins faster than rot-causing organisms could. Once these microbes dominated, they created a stable internal environment hostile to decay. This wasn't random. Cheesemakers reused tools, environments, and aging rooms precisely because they were already alive with the right organisms. Rot is not just decay, it is uncontrolled competition. Medieval cheese didn't rot because competition ended early. One side won and locked the system. Temperature control mattered, but not the way modern refrigeration works. Medieval people didn't try to make cheese cold. They tried to make it unchanging. Cheese hates fluctuation. Warm days followed by cold nights destroy stability. Stone cellars, caves, and underground rooms stayed cool year-round and changed slowly. That steadiness mattered more than low temperature. Airflow was equally critical. Cheese stored in stagnant air molds unpredictably. Cheese stored in rushing air dries and cracks. Medieval aging spaces balanced slow, constant airflow. Many were naturally ventilated through stone gaps or wooden slats. These spaces weren't designed on paper. They were perfected by survival. Rooms that ruined cheese were abandoned. Rooms that worked became tradition. Rinds were one of medieval cheese's greatest achievements. Modern consumers often peel them off, but medieval people treated rinds as living armor. A healthy rind blocked oxygen, insects, and invasive molds while regulating moisture exchange. Rinds were brushed, salted, washed, or smoked depending on region. Neglect killed cheese faster than heat ever did. Some cheeses were washed repeatedly with brine, wine, or beer. This wasn't culinary flair. Alcohol and salt adjusted surface acidity and microbial dominance. Medieval cheesemakers noticed that washed cheeses resisted spoilage longer and repeated the method faithfully. Flavor followed function, not the other way around. Raw milk itself gave medieval cheese a major advantage modern systems often lack. Raw milk contains complex microbial communities that establish balance early. Pasteurization removes this diversity, forcing modern cheesemakers to rebuild control artificially. Medieval systems let biology do the work, and biology, when guided correctly, is extremely stable. Even cheese size was a preservation decision. Medieval cheeses were large wheels because larger masses resist environmental swings better. A thick core stays protected even if the surface changes. Small cheeses spoil faster. Bigger wasn't indulgence, it was insurance. Most importantly, medieval cheese was never ignored. Cheesemaking didn't end when the wheel was formed. Cheese was turned, inspected, smelled, touched, adjusted. Problems were corrected early. Rot spread silently only when attention stops. Medieval food safety was not regulation, it was vigilance. The reason medieval cheese didn't rot is not that medieval people lacked knowledge, it's that they understood a truth modern systems avoid. You cannot freeze life and expect stability. You must guide it. Modern refrigeration didn't replace medieval cheese preservation because it worked better. It replaced it because it required less skill, less time, and less attention. Refrigeration is convenience masquerading as progress. Once cheese proved it could outlive milk, medieval societies began building food security around it. Cheese solved a problem that grain, meat, and vegetables could not solve at the same time. Portable protein that did not demand constant care. Livestock required feed even in winter. Meat spoiled quickly. Grain lacked protein density. Cheese sat quietly and waited. That made it ideal not only for households, but for monasteries, armies, travelers, and cities preparing for isolation.
This is why medieval records constantly mention cheese alongside bread and salt. These were not meals, they were survival units. Bread provided calories, salt preserved and regulated. Cheese supplied fat and protein in a form that did not collapse under time. One of the reasons cheese resisted rot so effectively was fat behavior. Medieval cheeses were often made from full-fat milk. Fat repels water. Less water meant fewer pathways for spoilage organisms. Over time, fats oxidized slowly, contributing to flavor but not destruction. Modern low-fat cheeses spoil faster precisely because they contain more water and fewer stabilizing fats. Another overlooked factor is acid control. During curd formation, medieval cheesemakers allowed milk sugars to ferment into lactic acid. This lowered pH early, creating an acidic environment hostile to many pathogens. Crucially, this acidification happened before aging began. Once pH stabilized, rot-causing bacteria struggled to gain a foothold. Medieval people didn't measure acidity. They recognized it by smell, texture, and taste. Their senses became instruments. Cheese aging spaces themselves became biological ecosystems. The same caves, cellars, and stone rooms were used year after year. Microbes embedded themselves into walls, shelves, and air. This created consistency. When cheese entered the space, it was immediately surrounded by familiar organisms that dominated before invaders could. Modern sterile environments lack this protective continuity. Medieval people also understood cheese zoning. Not all cheese aged the same way. Fresh cheeses stayed near kitchens. Hard cheeses moved deeper into cellars. Older wheels were separated from younger ones to prevent cross-contamination. This spatial organization reduced catastrophic failure. If one batch spoiled, others survived. Redundancy mattered. Another reason cheese didn't rot is that medieval people accepted surface imperfection. Mold on the outside was not panic-inducing. It was expected. Surface molds were scraped, brushed, or washed away regularly. The interior was what mattered. Modern consumers discard food at the first sign of surface change. Medieval people differentiated between cosmetic change and structural failure. Seasonal timing mattered as well. Most cheese was made in spring and early summer when milk was abundant. Aging occurred through cooler months when spoilage pressure dropped naturally. This seasonal rhythm aligned biology with climate. Modern year-round production ignores this alignment and compensates with machines. Cheese also benefited from labor timing efficiency. Cheese-making concentrated work into short periods when milk peaked. After that, cheese demanded attention, not energy. In times of crisis, food that does not demand fuel or daily labor becomes priceless.
In sieges and famines, cheese often outlasted bread. Bread went stale, molded, or was eaten quickly. Cheese could be rationed thinly over long periods. A small piece delivered fat, protein, and satiety. This made cheese a morale stabilizer, as well as nutrition. People endure hardship longer when hunger is delayed. Another hidden reason medieval cheese didn't rot is that it was expected to smell strong. Strong smell did not equal danger. In fact, smell often indicated successful aging. Medieval noses were trained differently. They judged cheese by internal consistency and taste, not surface odor. This sensory literacy prevented unnecessary waste. Cheese was also protected socially. Theft of cheese during scarcity carried severe penalties. Cheese represented months of stored nutrition. Losing it meant starvation later. That social seriousness reduced casual loss and mishandling. Modern abundance erodes that discipline. What emerges is a picture where cheese survived not because of one technique, but because every layer of medieval life supported its survival, from animal diet to cellar architecture to human behavior. Cheese didn't rot because medieval people refused to let it. They shaped biology, environment, time, and attention around one goal: making milk outlive the season. Medieval people didn't know which year would bring war, drought, plague, or failed harvests, but they did know that some year would. Cheese existed to bridge that unknown gap. One of the deepest reasons medieval cheese didn't rot is that it was produced inside a risk-layered system, not a single technique. Every stage assumed something else might fail and compensated for it. Take milk supply, for example. Milk is fragile and seasonal. Cows produce heavily in spring and summer, lightly or not at all in winter. Medieval societies accepted this limitation instead of fighting it. Cheese converted a seasonal flood of milk into a year-round protein reserve. That conversion reduced dependence on continuous animal productivity, which was highly vulnerable to disease, weather, and theft. Once milk became cheese, it entered a different risk category. Livestock could die overnight. Cheese could not. It could only fail slowly, and slow failure is survivable. Medieval cheesemakers also understood something modern systems often ignore. Perfect cleanliness is not the same as safety. Medieval dairies were not sterile, but they were stable. The same hands, tools, rooms, and surfaces were used repeatedly. This consistency mattered more than sanitation theater. The microbial environment became predictable. Predictability prevents rot far better than constant sterilization followed by exposure. Modern systems sterilize aggressively, then reintroduce food into unstable environments. Medieval systems maintained controlled continuity. Another overlooked factor is cheese density and shape as insurance. Thick wheels aged unevenly on purpose. Even if the outer layer failed, the interior often remained safe. This gave medieval people a buffer. They could cut away loss and keep the core. Modern sliced cheeses have no buffer. Failure spreads instantly. Cheese also benefited from low urgency consumption. Unlike bread, which stales quickly, or meat, which demands immediate use, cheese could be left alone. This reduced panic eating. Panic destroys food systems. Medieval planning favored foods that waited calmly. Cheese storage locations reveal more of this logic. Cellars weren't just cool, they were socially protected spaces. Not everyone had access. Movement was limited. Handling was controlled. Fewer hands meant fewer mistakes. Modern refrigeration centralizes food but multiplies access points, increasing mishandling and waste. Another critical reason cheese didn't rot is acceptance of transformation. Medieval people expected cheese to change over time. Texture would harden, flavor would sharpen, smell would intensify. Change did not equal danger. Modern culture expects food to remain frozen in a single state and panics when it doesn't. That expectation alone causes enormous waste. Cheese also aligned perfectly with medieval ration psychology. It could be shaved, sliced thin, or grated into meals. A small amount transformed bland grain into something sustaining. This efficiency allowed cheese to stretch across weeks without triggering starvation stress. Foods that psychologically satisfy people slow consumption. Cheese did exactly that. In monasteries and castles, cheese became part of formal ration systems. Portions were measured, aging stages were tracked. Older cheeses were consumed first, younger ones were protected. This rotation prevented hidden spoilage. Modern households rarely rotate food properly because abundance removes discipline. Another factor, almost never mentioned, cheese discouraged pests. Hard, salted rinds were unattractive to insects and rodents compared to grain or meat. Cheese did not invite infestation easily. That alone made it safer to store long term. And then there's climate adaptation. Medieval cheeses varied by region because climates varied. Dry climates produced harder cheeses. Damp climates produced washed rind cheeses that resisted mold differently. There was no universal solution, only local optimization. Modern mass cheese ignores this, then relies on refrigeration to compensate. What becomes undeniable is that medieval cheese didn't rot because every assumption around it was realistic. Food will sit for long periods. Conditions will fluctuate. People will make mistakes. Crises will interrupt routines. Cheese survived because it tolerated imperfection. Modern systems try to eliminate imperfection. When they fail suddenly. Medieval cheese systems expected failure and designed around it.